let's have another look at what's happening around the climate. Professor Patrick Bond has suggested that the 2019 Durban Climate Action Plan lacks urgency, although it is at least premised on what climate scientists have been predicting for at least a decade, that dry areas will have worse droughts and wet coastal and eastern areas of South Africa will have much more intense rain and more extreme weather events. To talk more about this now, we're speaking to Professor Patrick Bond. He's at the University of Western Cape. Professor Bond, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. You actually go as far as suggesting that President Ramaphosa and his government are guilty of hypocrisy over climate change. Why do you say that?
Well, yes, and just a correction now at the University of Johannesburg. Yes, no, I think the hypocrisy charge, including the very highly applauded adaptation strategies in Durban itself, that sticks. And as a result, one of the climate justice movements even put some culpable homicide charges against Ramaphosa and some of the key politicians. And the reason it sticks, Stephen, you'd remember, I'm sure, and maybe many of the viewers, to 2011. That would have been the COP17. Remember the Conference of the Parties, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Durban. And the dilemma is that there's been, especially since last October, when President Ramaphosa sort of really got onto the high horse and he put his Monday newsletter out on the question of climate, but it was really because of sanctions, it's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's basically a tariff that hits South African exports, and it's only then, really in October, just before the Glasgow Climate Summit, that we saw President Ramaphosa come to action. Likewise, in Durban, we've seen repeated applause, backslapping. Former Mayor Zandile Gumede was the vice chair of the C40, the big coalition of cities, but they've not done anything, and you saw that in 2017, huge rain bomb in October, and then April 2019, still nothing done, and now this absolute catastrophe, especially because so many of the probably 450 to 500 people who died really are from the shacks of Durban, from the low-income areas that they really could have given much more attention to, better housing, stormwater drainage. That's the action that would allow us to applaud, not accuse President Ramaphosa and Durban officials of hypocrisy.
Okay, so, I mean, all of these conversations in the end always come back to how we generate electricity. There's Sasol, I accept that, but in the end, the big thing that probably damages the climate in our society is Eskom and the incredibly reliable coal fleet that we have. We know that you're trying to change it. Should we just give it up all immediately and go to solar? I mean, it takes us to an argument about baseload power. It's also a big change to make in a society which has relied on coal for a long time.
Well, yes, partly because that, as you say, the base load is under a lot of, let me say, skeptical inquiry, because the two biggest consumers, Eskom, that's BHP Billiton, South 32 it's called now, in Richards Bay with the big aluminium smelter, and the Anglo Empire. So they've now just said they're going to go to renewable. That whole argument they needed coal or maybe nuclear as baseload falls away. Because if you had the renewable supply, we'd need probably 70,000 megawatts of supply, but then you'd have backup, which isn't just lithium. That's what people think of their own home, backup system. But actually, it's called pump storage, and we have one in Gula. For the country, we have a couple in Cape Town. That means you pump up during the day when the sun is shining, the wind is blowing, and you allow that then to come back down when it's a cloudy day or at night. Secondly, we have molten salt. Those storage systems, Stephen, I mean, you don't really need the baseload argument. And I'd also question, whether some of the electricity consumption, Sasol in particular, number one source of CO2 emissions in the whole world in Secunda, that single point source, what is it doing? It's squeezing coal to get petrol. And we've got to find a much more efficient way than using Sasol very, very high carbon production petrol. Because, we can basically say with Eskom and with Sasol, those two companies, especially with their local pollution, really have to be addressed explicitly.
There's a lot there. I'm sure someone is going to disagree with what you say, Professor Bond. There's another angle to all of this, and we see this in two ways. It's about the inequality of the impact of climate change. So we understand that our climate is being affected twice as quickly as some other regions in the world, when in fact, if you look at the great big scheme of things, the countries that have really sort of damaged the climate are probably the United States, Europe, the global north. Let me put it in that category. And you see actually the same in our society, as I understand it. So the richer you are, the more you consume. But the richer you are, the less likely it is that your house is going to be pushed away by a flood.
unless you're an Mshloti like those rich folk that dear fellow Andrew is going to help. Look, I think that's the critical question now, which is the climate debt, the reparations really that should be paid to especially some 40,000 displacees, and we can't count even the value of the lives of up to 500 people, nearly all black, and that probably predominantly women and children. We haven't got the race, class, gender breakdown yet, but this is obviously a case where those who did the least damage suffer the most. It's that classic climate injustice. Now, I think what's happening in some explicit ways, like Patrice Motsepe, one of the great coal barons of the country through Africa Rainbow Minerals Coal, or Mike Teke, disclosure at UJ where I teach, he's the council chair, and I think he's put 100,000 and Patrice Motsepe 30 million. I'd love those two wonderful men to say, we owe a climate debt because we profited from this destructive process of CO2. Look, I'm also to blame as an academic flying around too much. We all are in the, let's say, upper middle class, the white especially. Our communities have a climate debt. If you believe what's called polluter pays philosophy, it's time to start kicking in because the people who've lost their lives, their possessions, their houses, and need the jobs that will come from reconstruction done properly. Those would be obviously lower income, working class, and women, and they're black and African and Indian and colored people. Those who took the hit didn't cause the problem. Those of us who have benefits from high carbon footprints, well, we should be paying more. There are ways to do that through carbon taxes, for example, on airfares and for the consumption goods, and a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a climate tax, sanctions really against South African goods is probably in the offing starting next year from Europe and then the US and the UK. Hypocrisy there for sure. They should be paying their climate debt. But in the meantime, we've got to really restructure, don't we?
Professor Patrick Bond at the University of Johannesburg, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate the time.